For stalkers, happiness always wears the same face. To make it back alive, skirt the anomalies, stuff your pockets with loot, and cash out, that's the whole of the joy. But misfortune? That's different for everyone, because the zone is inventive and cooks up a special surprise for each of us. A stalker by the nickname of Gupi knew what happiness was. He'd been trampling the zone for 5 years now, remaining hale and hearty. But he didn't believe in luck. Gupi relied only on his knowledge of the terrain, the habits of mutants, and the golden rule: walk alone. People might sell you out to save their own hides, but a loner answers only to himself. Gupi never pledged allegiance to clans, never nursemaided rookies or tourists, and never took contract hits. He simply vanished into the zone, crawled into the deadliest hellholes, and returned with a container packed with the rarest artifacts. He didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. His singular, insurmountable vice was real, fresh-brewed coffee. He brewed it everywhere, even in the deep zone, ignoring warnings that the scent drew mutants and marauders like flies to honey. Gupi was damn cautious about everything else, but he just couldn't give up the coffee. This time, Gupi set up camp in a reliable stash near Lake Yantar. It was a spot shielded from the psychotropic emissions of the local radar. A former entrance to military bunkers collapsed from the inside. Gupi got a small fire going, set an old tin pot on the flames, and savored the aroma as it overpowered the stench of swamp rot. He was satisfied. The raid had been a success. In his containers lay singing springs, segments of a chain, dragon's eyes, and a briquette of doom mummy. Tucked in his pack was a capsule of dead water, painstakingly collected from a bush with a special dropper. The day had passed quietly, barring a scuffle with a German zombie that he'd had to decapitate with his machete. Gupi planned to wait out the night, catch a few winks, and head for the scientists and traders come morning. The idyll was shattered by a drawn-out moan from the direction of the lake. An invisible, dead stalker began pleading pitifully for help. Gupi knew it was a phantom's trap to lure people into the mire, so he just spat on the ground and went back to his coffee. He took the pot off the fire, poured a cup, downed it, and reached for a refill. The moment his hand touched the handle, a shadow flickered in the entryway. Gupi didn't have time to react. A powerful, springy blow to the chest hurled him against the wall. The coffee spilled onto the embers, hissing and filling the cramped space with intoxicating steam. Gupi landed on his side, but immediately snatched up his rifle. He clicked on the underbarrel flashlight. The beam snatched a gray, shapeless something out of the darkness where nothing had been a second before. The stalker didn't ask questions. He squeezed the trigger. A short burst tore through the silence. The creature, it turned out to be a Burer, a telekinetic dwarf, sprang to its feet. The little freak threw up its stubby hands, trying to summon its power. It tried to lift a concrete slab to hurl at the human, but the block merely twitched and slumped back down. Then the Burer directed its energy at Gupi. The stalker was pinned to the wall by an invisible press, but the pressure was weak. Gupi calmly took aim and unloaded the entire magazine into the dwarf until the bolt clicked dry. Reloading his weapon, Gupi cautiously approached the fallen enemy. The Burer was still alive, but behaving oddly. Usually, these beasts didn't creep into human shelters. Gupi flipped the dwarf over with his boot and saw a gaping, old, already scabbed bullet wound in the freak's temple. It became clear. The Burer hadn't crawled into the stash to hunt, but to hide, and perhaps stash something away. Dying, the dwarf convulsively clutched a hand to its chest beneath its rags. Guppy slammed his rifle butt into its temple to silence it for good, then began searching the reeking tatters. Under layers of filthy clothing, he found an Army PDA belonging, judging by the markings, to a Belgian soldier from the perimeter guard. The screen was smashed, the device dead. Guppy realized the Bureau had stolen the gadget, caught a bullet, fled, and died here trying to protect its shiny prize. Smirking at the mutant's stupidity, Guppy tossed the useless PDA into the fire. The plastic began to melt, the casing cracked, and a flash drive popped out of a hidden slot. This piqued the Stalker's interest. He fished the flash drive out of the fire, let it cool, and slotted it into his own PDA. The drive was clean of viruses and contained a single image file. A strange labyrinth schematic opened on the screen. A tangle of lines, red and green dots, question marks at the nodes, and a black square in the very center. The picture resembled a child's Find the Path puzzle, where several entrances lead to dead ends, and only one leads to the goal. Guppy traced one of the lines with his eyes, and, sure enough, it hit the black square. Deciding the military was just amusing themselves out of boredom by drawing nonsense rebuses, Guppy gave a disappointed grunt. He chalked it up to another whim of people who lacked a real dream. Twirling the flash drive in his fingers, he tossed it back into the fire, destroying the find. Outside, the dead Stalker howled again, begging for help and complaining of thirst. Guppy rudely told the Phantom where to go. The dead Stalker prowled around the hideout all night, wearing Guppy down with its endless, mournful wailing. Guppy regretted that he had no rounds left for his trophy grenade launcher. Otherwise, he would have certainly fired at the Phantom, purely for moral satisfaction and to settle his nerves. Only near morning did the Phantom pipe down. Guppy didn't even bother watching it take its habitual walk across the water of Lake Yantar, stepping on the roofs of submerged cars before dissolving into the fog. The Stalker gathered his gear, meticulously extinguished the fire, and crawled out. He carefully swept away the tracks left from dragging the Bureau's corpse and blocked the entrance to the shelter with an old snag so that an outsider could pass 2 steps away and notice nothing. Guppy spat over his left shoulder to avoid meeting a fool, but the superstition failed. He hadn't gone 2 kilometers toward the scientific camp when he stumbled upon a madman. A man in a light blue bodysuit, the kind scientists wear under their hazmat suits, was wandering near the water with a blissful smile, collecting dry grass. Guppy realized immediately this was another egghead driven insane by the psychotropic emissions of the lake. Usually, such types are visited by the ghosts of dead relatives. Guppy called out to the lunatic. The man frightenedly clutched his bouquet to his chest. It turned out the madman understood Russian. He was Felix Strauch from Biarritz, France. He explained that he was gathering flowers for Denise, who had called him to the lake. When Guppy asked when Denise had died, the Frenchman replied that it was 3 years ago, yet continued to insist she was alive. Guppy, eyeing a reward for returning a fugitive, decided to play along. He told him they were in Wonderland, where anything is possible, and that Denise had changed her mind, sending the Stalker to bring Felix to her. The Frenchman happily agreed. They moved along the path. Ahead, Guppy noticed a crushed log, splintered as if stepped on by a giant. It looked suspicious. The detector was silent, so the Stalker decided to play it safe. He stopped the Frenchman, pulled out a heavy, rusty bolt, and tossed it into the area of the suspected anomaly. The bolt landed normally. Guppy ordered Felix to walk exactly where the bolt had fallen. The Frenchman walked over,
picked up the bolt and joyfully showed it to the Stalker. Guppy took the bolt back and let the madman take point, using him as a living mine detector, though he relied more on his own memory of the terrain. Suddenly, Felix darted off the path and through the bushes. Guppy cursed and ran after him. The Frenchman fell to his knees before a huge, bright scarlet flower with a fleshy stem. Guppy had never seen anything like it, and immediately shouted for him not to touch the plant. He tried to explain to the lunatic that the flowers here were alive and dangerous, but Felix, enchanted by his find, reached out and touched a petal. The bud instantly came to life, swayed, and spat a viscous, milky white mass into the scientist's face. The Frenchman tried to scream, but the slime glued his mouth shut. The petals unfolded, shot out sticky threads, and tightly engulfed the victim's head. Guppy knew he should run, but greed overpowered him. He didn't want to lose the money for the botanist. The Stalker dropped to one knee and severed the flower's stem at the root with a burst from his rifle. Felix toppled onto his side, clutching his head, which was plastered with petals. Guppy grabbed him by the legs and dragged him back to the path, away from the bushes. He suspected it was a mimic mutant, which had assumed the form of a flower plucked from the victim's consciousness.
After looking around and checking his detector, only a couple of cowardly fleshes were lurking nearby. Guppy tended to the wounded man. There was a pulse. The petals on the Frenchman's head began to turn black. Guppy pried them up with his knife and started peeling them off. Beneath them, a gruesome sight was revealed. The mutant's digestive juices, containing a potent anesthetic, had already eaten away the face. The skin had sloughed off, exposing the bones of the cheekbones and forehead. The lips were reduced to tatters, and in place of eyes were bloody hollows. Felix felt no pain due to the anesthesia. Guppy splashed the last of the water from his canteen onto the man's face to wash away the acid, then donned a rubber glove and scooped the slime out of his mouth so he wouldn't suffocate. The Stalker jerked the mutilated Frenchman to his feet and drove him forward, prodding him with the barrel of his rifle. The fleshes trailed them, drawn by the scent of fresh blood and death. Somewhere to the right, the detector picked up a large target, possibly a young bloodsucker, but it hesitated to attack. Guppy hurried. Soon, the concrete fence of the scientific camp appeared, complete with watchtowers and barbed wire. A guard on a tower spotted them and waved toward the airlock. Right at the entrance, the anesthetic wore off. Felix began to scream wildly and bash his head against the armored airlock door. Guppy pinned him down. "Into the video sensor for them to open up faster!" The guards above just suggesting the Stalker shoot the sufferer himself, but Guppy refused to waste his ammo. A pack of blind dogs was already picking up their trail. Finally, the green light flared and the door slid open. Inside the airlock, they were met by two men in yellow bioprotection suits. Guppy shoved the blind and screaming Felix inside. The scientists immediately wrestled their colleague onto a gurney, swaddled him in film, and wheeled him into the complex without a word of thanks to the Stalker. One of them simply swept a radiation detector over Guppy and opened the inner door to the camp. The Stalker didn't care. He was only interested in the payment for the laboratory's returned property. The place where the scientists lived and worked, guarded by the military, had long ceased to be a mere campsite of tents and trailers. Now it was a bona fide fortified stronghold, capable of withstanding a long siege, a miniature city with its own infrastructure. It was here that Guppy met Stephen, the deputy head of science, a short blonde man in glasses and a blue jumpsuit. Stephen immediately inquired about the hall, and Guppy shook the container. The scientist expressed disbelief upon seeing only a couple of chains and springs,
suspecting the Stalker was holding back the prime loot. Guppy didn't deny it, but stated flatly that the rest of the swag wasn't for sale to the eggheads. They headed to Stephen's office to discuss the deal without the soldiers, who were warming their ears nearby, overhearing. En route, Guppy reminded him of the debt for saving the mad Frenchman, Felix. Stephen, who spoke excellent Russian, initially feigned ignorance, but then asked for details. Guppy described the strange mimic mutant in the form of a giant flower that read the victim's memory. Instead of horror, the deputy of science showed professional interest. He lamented that such specimens only reached them dead, and daydreamed about acquiring a live controller. Guppy called him crazy and advised him to contact the swamp doctor, but the scientists had already tried to negotiate with the zone's legend and had been told exactly where to shove it due to differences in opinion regarding the nature of the local hell. Passing the barracks and the vivarium, Guppy asked about women, but Stephen curtly replied that there were no women in the camp. They ascended the external staircase to the second floor of the administration building and entered the office. Guppy was habitually surprised by the presence of a leather sofa in such a backwater. He dropped his backpack and rig and made small talk about daily life, discovering that the scientists even had their disposable socks imported. Then they got down to business. Stephen produced a special cylinder made of leaded glass for receiving artifacts. Guppy poured in the springs and the chain segments. The springs remained silent, unwilling to sing for the scientist, and the chains looked sluggish. Stephen began to inspect the goods critically, hinting at the need to check the artifact's activity, though Guppy never brought empties. While the scientist was busy with the appraisal, Guppy asked to arrange a bunk for him in the barracks. Stephen again offered the Stalker contract work, but was refused. Guppy had no desire to become a guinea pig. Then the conversation turned to payment. Stephen admitted the goods brought in weren't worth much and complained about glitchy scanners. Guppy demanded to see something worthwhile. The scientist hesitated, then produced a nickel-plated box. Inside lay a black disc with indicators and nodules, the newest Army diagnostic medkit, the HL-22, equipped with artificial intelligence. Stephen explained that the device diagnosed shock or poisoning on its own and injected the necessary cocktail of drugs through microneedles. Guppy immediately appreciated the utility of the item and tried to barter for it with his springs and a dozen cartridges thrown in. Stephen was outraged by such cheek, declaring the device unique and one of only 25 in existence. He demanded the contents of the second container, the dragon's eyes and the doom mummy, in exchange. Guppy refused, as he was saving that loot for the trader Toad, who paid better. Stephen tried to appeal to his conscience, saying that hucksters profited from sick people by reselling medicine at triple the price, and pleaded for material for Dr. Fredrickson's research. But Guppy was adamant. The medkit was good, but not worth being left without money for ammo and gear. Then Stephen played his trump card. He offered the medkit and a huge sum of money, not for artifacts, but for a special mission. The scientists wanted to shut down the Psi radar on Lake Yantar and were looking for a guide to lead a military group into the catacombs. They had even developed a prototype protective helmet. Upon hearing this, Guppy categorically refused. He knew the underground teemed with Bureaus, and going down there with a squad of soldiers who only knew how to shout, "Yes, sir," was suicide. Neither the money nor the offer of amnesty interested him. He abruptly cut off the persuasion, demanded standard payment in cash and dry rations for the Frenchman, and, leaving his gear in the office under supervision, went off to sleep, taking a final jab at the disappointed scientist on his way out.
In the zone, you can never fully relax. Even sleep, for a stalker, carries the risk of never waking up. However, the scientific camp was an exception, a fortress where Guppy allowed himself 4 hours of shut-eye on a bunk in the barracks. He didn't strip down, only removing his boots. He woke a minute before his PDA timer buzzed and immediately checked the news network. The feed was routine. A shootout in the Sin clan, Monolith fighters missing in action, a blind dog attack, and yet another death of the stalker Semetsky in the rusty forest. Guppy cleaned himself up, washed his face, made his bed, and noted that the local soldiers never smiled, as if they felt death lurking around every corner. Time was tight. He needed to reach the Stalker bar before dark. Guppy headed to Stephen's office, but the door was locked. He waited on the gallery, watching the camp. Soon, the deputy head of science appeared, bringing the Stalker lunch in an aluminum mess tin. It was real homemade food, meat goulash with beans and, most importantly, a cup of fresh-brewed, non-instant coffee. While Guppy ate with relish, Stephen grilled him about the found Frenchman, Felix. The scientist was interested in whether the madman had been alone. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, Stephen admitted that 2 of their soldiers had gone missing. Guppy recalled the fresh zombie with a bazooka he'd killed yesterday, but that one had been in a German uniform, while the camp was guarded by American Marines. Stephen paid for the Frenchman's rescue with an envelope of dollars. Guppy counted the cash, packed the leftover dry rations into his backpack, and reminded him that he'd be taking the artifacts to the trader Toad, his main investor. Leaving, the stalker grabbed the empty mess tin from the table to dispose of the trash and said his goodbyes. Running out of the administration building, Guppy checked his loot. Along with the dirty dishes, he had subtly swiped the very same HL-22 Advanced Army Injector medkit from the table, the one Stephen had demanded an exorbitant price or a suicidal underground trek for. The stalker's conscience was clear. He simply took what he needed. On his way to the exit, Guppy tossed the mess tin through the washroom window. At that moment, a young, ginger-haired American scientist with a camera ran up to him, begging for a souvenir photo with a real stalker. Instead of posing, Guppy, wearing the grim smile of a man who has seen death, suggested the kid step outside the gates and take the picture there, against the backdrop of the zone. The terrified American, stammering that it was dangerous out there, ran away in horror. At the checkpoint, the soldier in the tower warned that burnt fuzz was flying. Guppy thanked him, fastened his helmet, and draped a dense mosquito mesh over his face. He pulled long rubber gloves onto his hands, securing them with elastic bands. Scarcely had he stepped beyond the perimeter when a clump of burnt fuzz struck his face, but the mesh saved his skin from the chemical burn. His detector showed activity: a pack of blind dogs to the east, wandering fleshes, and scattered zombies. Guppy moved cautiously through the thickets, which were draped in rusty fluff, stepping over silver-gray grass. He decided to skirt the southern shore of Lake Yantar, adhering to the rule that, in the zone, you never return the same way you came. Guppy emerged onto a secret trail, a route he and his partner Mosquito had marked with signs, as new anomalies rarely formed there. The signs were in place, and the stalker quickly covered several kilometers. Ahead lay an abandoned quarry filled with rusty machinery, where detectors worked poorly and bloodsuckers liked to hide. Guppy began his descent down a slope overgrown with ugly trees and bushes plastered with fuzz, looking like giant toxic dandelions. The detector pinged a group of 5 targets ahead,
identifying them as zombies. Guppy didn't fear them. He even pitied them, preferring to bypass rather than kill. He readied his rifle, brushed the sticky fuzz from his face mesh, and called out to the hiding figures to clear the road. But instead of a mindless moan, a crisp command rang out from behind the trees. "Lower the weapon, Stalker. Take one step, and you're dead."
Guppy realized he'd walked into an ambush by trusting the device. The display showed 5 blips, a standard group, a guide, an assistant, and 3 rookies. But they had fanned out, and Guppy found himself in their crosshairs. He identified himself, but a voice with a foreign accent ordered him to drop his weapon. Arguing with 5 barrels was pointless. Guppy deliberately moved slowly, placing his rifle on the ground, unbuckling his holster belt, and, fumbling until the 3rd try, unfastening the carabiner of his backpack and shedding his rig with the grenades. As he did so, he suggested the invisible men look for more weapons themselves. A smirk, resembling a scar, made the enemies hesitate. Guppy tried to seize the initiative by asking about the attackers' problems, but from behind ordered him to raise his hands. He was professionally frisked, losing his knife and a concealed stiletto. Guppy was ordered to step away from his gear. 2 fighters in camouflage and full-face helmets, looking like Imperial stormtroopers and armed with M21 rifles, stepped out from behind the trees. Behind the Stalker stood a Monolith fighter, which was unbelievable. That clan usually sat tight in Pripyat, guarding the center of the zone. Another Monolith fighter appeared, and the 5th turned out to be a member of the Sin clan, nicknamed Werewolf. Wearing an old tanker's helmet, armed with a shotgun, his face crisscrossed with scars. The company was as strange and motley as they came. American Marines, fanatics from Pripyat, and a cultist. The American threw the melted carcass of a PDA at Guppy's feet. The Stalker recognized the gadget he had burned the night before and realized this group had been watching his stash. The Sinner, Werewolf, accused Guppy of causing the death of his friend, nicknamed Salo, who had fallen into a witch's jelly trap in the Stalker's hideout. Guppy remarked that they shouldn't have been crawling into other people's holes. It turned out Salo had gone blind, and his friends had simply shot him as a burden. This entire ragtag gang was hunting for the flash drive from that PDA. Guppy honestly admitted he had burned it, mistaking the contents for a child's maze game. The Monolith fighters, if he had seen the file, he had memorized the map. Ricochet, the leader of the Monolith duo, explained to the others that Guppy was a unique stalker with a phenomenal memory, capable of reproducing the map from his mind. Werewolf wanted to shoot the prisoner, but Ricochet reined him in, stating that Guppy was their only chance. Guppy confirmed he remembered the map, but refused to draw it, realizing that the moment he did, they would kill him. He pointed out that the Sinner was dreaming of putting a bullet in his back, while he himself could sell the information to others. Ricochet agreed and issued an ultimatum. Guppy was coming with them to the CNPP. The conversation was interrupted by the attack of a flesh springing from the bushes. Werewolf blasted it in the snout, and the beast fled. After that, the dialogue resumed. Guppy tried to refuse, but Ricochet made it clear there was no choice. They revealed their hand. They possessed a detailed plan of the underground communications beneath the sarcophagus, acquired by the Sinners in an old Sea Consciousness Project bunker. This map was the key to the legendary Monolith, the Wish Granter. The Americans, Sergeants Shrek and Gates, sharing a surname with Bill, turned out to be the very missing soldiers Stephen had spoken of. They possessed experimental protection against psi emissions, which would allow the group to pass through the deadly red forest. The Monolith fighters, Ricochet and Fly, turned out to be instructors from the camp in the Dark Valley who knew the way. The entire group consisted of deserters and outcasts, dreaming of reaching the Monolith and granting their wishes. Assessing the situation, Gupi realized they would kill him if he refused. He decided to pretend he agreed to participate in this crusade for happiness, hoping to escape along the way. Of the legend of the Monolith, and remembering that in the original story, Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, the wish machine brought happiness to no one, he nonetheless refrained from voicing his thoughts aloud.
Gupi reached for his assault rifle, but Ricochet confiscated the weapon, declaring that the Stalker would only get it back in the dead city once he had proven his loyalty. Gupi, knowing full well that walking unarmed was suicide, tried to object, but Ricochet stood his ground, arguing it was for the group's safety. Gupi had to agree. He shouldered his backpack and fell into the column behind the Americans. Ricochet brought up the rear. Fly walked point, leading the group competently, skirting dangerous areas and striving to avoid anomalies. Gupi noted his professionalism, a sharp contrast to the rookie probes the group had picked up along the way. The three young stalkers, Chatterbox, Elephant, and Fondue, were cocky and well-equipped, but completely unprepared for the zone. Fly immediately schooled them with his fists, explaining the basic rules of survival. The group moved toward the Red Forest via the Dead City, as the route through the army warehouses was closed due to a conflict between the sinners and the locals. Gupi planned to escape in the Dead City once the inevitable firefight broke out, then make his way to the army warehouses and sell the group out. Along the way, they returned fire against dogs and fleshes. One of the rookies, Chatterbox, fell victim to a zombie that attacked him from behind. Ricochet and Fly used the situation as a lesson for the others, forcing the rookies to finish off a second zombie. Chatterbox, bitten on the cheek, was in a panic, terrified of turning into a zombie. But Gupi calmed him down, explaining that it was merely an infection. The squad approached a field overgrown with strange, violet vegetation, resembling mutated hemp. Gupi sensed danger, but Ricochet brushed off his warnings, relying on his detector. Suddenly, a giant mutant boar burst from the thicket and attacked Ricochet. The Monolith fighter dodged, and the group opened fire. Gupi, seizing the moment amidst the chaos, dashed over to Fly, where his backpack with the weapons lay. While the stalkers were finishing off the first boar, a second one flew out of the bushes, chasing the rookie Elephant. The beast trampled the fallen boy and lunged at the others. Gupi, instead of fleeing, hurled a modified grenade filled with adhesive foam at the boar. It entangled the beast, binding its movements. Gupi coolly slit the mutant's throat with his machete. The American, Shrek, identified the grenade as a non-lethal G8, but was surprised that the foam hardened so quickly. Gupi explained that it was a modification by a stalker named Gilza. After the fight, Gupi took advantage of the moment to reclaim his tactical rig and rifle. No one, not even Ricochet, stood in his way, and Fly even handed him spare magazines, acknowledging Guppy's contribution to saving the group. Gupi realized something was wrong when their guide, Fly, started getting nervous and losing the trail, as if something was preventing him from leading the group straight. Ricochet, the Monolith leader, noticed it too and sent Werewolf to the rear guard. The group passed the former hemp field with its mutated plants and emerged at an abandoned fruit nursery, where poisonous berries grew and craters gaped open, lined with glowing moss. Suddenly, Ricochet stopped the squad and announced that the bus where they had planned to spend the night had vanished. Werewolf, not mincing words, tore into Ricochet, demanding explanations. The conflict nearly escalated into a shootout. Fly drew a bead on the sinner, but Guppy intervened, putting a pistol to Fly's head and defusing the situation. It became clear that the Monolith fighters had never actually been to this place,
and were leading the men to a point they knew only by hearsay. Guppy realized their expertise was a myth, and the group had been dragged into a dangerous gamble. The situation was aggravated by the fact that very little daylight remained. Guppy took the initiative, ordering everyone to dig in. Using entrenching tools, the group excavated a shelter in the center of an old crater, reinforcing it with a parapet of the glowing moss. Guppy assigned watch shifts and issued instructions: make no noise, use no lights, and shoot at any shadow crossing the glowing ring. During the preparations, Werewolf confessed to Guppy that the map was genuine, from a secret military archive, and led to the Monolith, which had been the target of the Sea Consciousness Project. The sinner turned out not to be a fanatic, but a cynical outcast with simply nothing left to lose. Guppy began to feel a peculiar respect for him. In the night, Guppy woke to the sound of gunfire. A pack of 30 blind dogs had attacked the camp. They acted in an organized fashion, controlled by an alpha, a black Chernobyl dog. The dogs circled the trench, waiting for the moment to launch a coordinated assault. Guppy, understanding the alpha's tactics, ordered lights out to avoid attracting more beasts, but Ricochet panicked and switched on his flashlight, blinding everyone. Guppy knocked him out with a butt stroke, regaining control of the situation. The Stalker devised a plan. Distract the pack by allowing one dog to jump into the trench, where Werewolf would deal with it, while the others beat back the rest. Meanwhile, Guppy and the American Shrek headed into the darkness to hunt the telepathic alpha. Using the empty mind technique taught to him by the Swamp Doctor, Guppy managed to get close to the black dog. Shrek, who also knew meditation techniques, covered him. They fired their underbarrel grenade launchers in sync, gravely wounding the mutant, then finished it off with a barrage of fire. Shrek emptied a pistol magazine into the corpse, just to be sure. However, immediately after their victory, a bloodsucker attacked them, materializing behind Shrek's back. Guppy saved the American by unleashing a burst right over his shoulder into the monster's mug. Falling, Shrek managed to shoot the creature in the gut, but the bloodsucker ripped the rifle from his hands and smashed it, then vanished, cloaking itself to regenerate. Guppy hauled up the concussed Shrek, and they sprinted back to the trench, racing against the invisible hunter.
After the death of the alpha, the pack of blind dogs lost coordination and soon scattered, leaving the group alone. Werewolf, cursing, discovered that the dog he had been wrestling with had managed to piss on him. The stalkers checked the perimeter. Shrek boasted that they had winged the bloodsucker, but Guppy warned that a wounded mutant wouldn't charge the trench. It would go to ground and start hunting come morning. The rest of the night passed in dampness and cold under a drizzling rain. Guppy, whose watch came just before dawn, hatched a plan. He wanted to slip away unnoticed while Fly was on guard, taking weapons, ammo, and meds, but ditching the heavy backpack of artifacts. However, this plan collapsed when he realized the wounded, angry bloodsucker was lurking somewhere very close. Standing alone against such a beast with just one rifle was impossible, so Guppy was forced to stick with the squad. In the morning, while the others slept, Guppy ate a tin of self-heating rations. When the camp woke, it became clear the rookies were in terrible shape. Chatterbox, bitten by the zombie, had a badly inflamed cheek. Fly, checking the wound, brutally ripped off the bio-glue film, accused the kid of lying, and forced Fondue to sew up the festering gash. Elephant, injured by the boar, could barely walk due to broken ribs and a smashed knee. Ricochet pulled Guppy aside, and they cynically discussed the wounded man's fate. Ricochet wanted to ditch the deadweight, but Guppy suggested placing Elephant at the tail of the column, as a sacrifice for the pursuing bloodsucker, so it would eat its fill and back off. Ricochet loudly approved the plan, ensuring everyone heard what a brain Guppy was. Before moving out, Guppy noticed a zombie sitting nearby and tossed him a pack of crackers. The group formed up.
Fly on point, followed by Chatterbox, Guppy, Ricochet, and at the tail, the limping elephant, relieved of his load and even his rifle. Guppy's detector showed they were now being tracked not by one, but by two bloodsuckers. The beasts were working in a pair. Fly led the squad, skirting clusters of discharger anomalies, and brought the group to an abandoned farmstead. There was no avoiding this place. Fields of creeping mold and bushes draped in strange blue webbing stretched all around. The farmstead looked suspiciously quiet. Guppy scanned the yard. A listing house, a rotten porch, and a well. His attention was drawn to the handle of the well's windlass. It gleamed, as if polished by frequent touching. Guppy halted the group and ordered Elephant to go to the well for recon. The wounded boy walked obediently, like a man condemned, but stopped before a wide drainage ditch, unable to jump it with his bad leg. Ricochet started yelling at him, but Guppy intervened and ordered another man sent. The choice fell on Chatterbox. He dropped his pack, hopped the ditch, and, rifle at the ready, slowly approached the log frame. Guppy shouted for him not to touch anything, but it was too late. The moment Chatterbox got close, a formless, transparent substance, like liquid glass, surged up from the well. It refracted the light, distorting the outlines of objects. The creature crashed down, blanketed the rookie, and instantly engulfed him like a giant amoeba. Chatterbox, suspended upside down inside the transparent mass, managed to pull the trigger. The rifle fired greenish discharges, and the barrel covered in cracks. The glassy mass began to flow out of the well, filling the yard and spilling over the ditch. Guppy yelled, "Run!" and was the first to bolt, outstripping even the guide. Elephant, frozen in horror, hesitated. Guppy ran, vaulting obstacles, and heard a drawn-out, inhuman scream behind him, but didn't look back. He flew over a hillock, hit the grass, and readied his weapon. Fly tumbled down next to him. The others had lagged behind. Guppy crawled up the rise and checked the road with his binoculars. There lay the flattened body of Elephant with twisted limbs. In his panic, the kid had run straight into a gravitational anomaly. Soon, Ricochet, Werewolf, Shrek, and Fondue caught up. The group had lost 2 men. Through the binoculars, Guppy saw movement in the bushes near the farmstead. It was the young bloodsucker. The monster emerged onto the road and headed toward Elephant's corpse, intending to dine. But reaching a paw toward the body, the bloodsucker triggered the same gravitational trap. A crunch echoed out. The invisible force snapped the mutant's limb at a right angle. The beast howled and retreated back into the bushes. Ricochet pounced on Guppy, blaming him for Chatterbox's death. But the stalker replied coldly that if not for the check, the creature would have engulfed the whole group at once. When Gates asked what kind of thing had been in the well, Guppy replied that he had no idea and warned the deeper into the zone, the worse the nightmares.
One of the bloodsuckers, having fallen into the gravitational trap, was left behind. But the second continued the pursuit, flickering in and out on the edge of the detector's display. Guppy explained to his companions that the mutant thirsted for revenge for the night skirmish and would only back off in the dead city, where there were plenty of zombies, meat too rotten for its taste. Scarcely had the group emerged from the rotten forest when 3 black Apache Army helicopters appeared on the horizon, flying straight at them. Ricochet panicked and ordered a retreat back into the woods, but Guppy and Werewolf flatly refused to backtrack, knowing that in the zone, retracing your steps meant certain death. The Americans backed the Stalker, and the group continued moving toward the choppers. The roar of the rotors grew, pressing on their ears,
but suddenly the machines vanished, dissolving into the sky. Guppy surmised it was a temporal anomaly, or a mirage, and harshly berated Ricochet for attempting to violate the rules of the zone. The squad approached the territory of an abandoned farm, enclosed by a concrete fence. The slab walls were covered in a web of cracks oozing a silvery liquid, with translucent, glass-like threads stretching toward the men. A frightening silence reigned. Fly, Walking Point, stumbled over a skeleton in decayed clothing, wearing a Duty Clan bandana. The corpse lay in an unnatural pose, arms thrown behind its head, elbows pointing at the horizon. Guppy looked in the indicated direction and saw that the horizon line was curved upward, resembling a bowl. Sensing the mortal danger of a gigantic anomaly, the Stalker immediately ordered a retreat along the fence, and the group obeyed without question. The only path lay through an old cattle yard overgrown with tall wormwood. A toppled water tower lay across the yard. Guppy noticed the handle of the well's windlass was unnaturally polished, but they didn't stop to investigate. The Stalker chose the last remaining rookie, Fondue, and forced him to go first, probing the path with bolts. The boy was afraid, but Guppy smacked him in the face to bring him to his senses and made him put on a respirator as the wormwood was shedding abundant pollen. Fondue advanced slowly, and the radiation levels began to rise rapidly. Deep in the yard, Guppy spotted movement. Checking his binoculars with infravision, he saw a pseudo-giant. The huge carcass was swaying strangely back and forth. It soon became clear the monster wasn't alone. 3 fleshes and several armed zombies stepped out behind it. The entire entourage moved with unnatural synchronicity. They were being led by a controller. Guppy ordered everyone to ready their underbarrel grenade launchers for a simultaneous volley at the giant's knees. But at that moment, the group made a mistake, focusing on the visible threat and forgetting their rear. The invisible bloodsucker that had been tracking them attacked from the tall grass. It materialized right in front of Werewolf, and both roared. The monster knocked the sinner down, pinning him to the earth despite a point-blank buckshot blast. Gates struck the beast with his rifle butt, and Ricochet slashed its throat with a knife. The wounded bloodsucker hurled the Monolith leader aside and swiped at Shrek, shredding his body armor. Fly threw a knife to Ricochet, while Fondue lay on the ground, covering his head with his arms. In the chaos of the fight, Guppy noticed the pseudo-giant was approaching, but not toward the humans. The massive mutant walked up to the grappling bloodsucker and werewolf. It gently prodded the bloodsucker with a claw. Enraged, the bloodsucker abandoned the human and lunged at the giant. A battle of monsters erupted. The bloodsucker, dodging blows from the powerful paws, slashed the giant's snout with its talons, while the giant tried to trample its agile opponent. Eventually, the pseudo-giant knocked the bloodsucker off its feet, clamped its beak-like maw onto the creature's stomach, and began to shake it. The zombies and fleshes watched the fight, ignoring the humans. The controller had shifted its attention to the clash of the beasts. Werewolf, seizing the moment, crawled out from under the brawl, covered in the bloodsucker's black blood, and lit a cigarette. Guppy realized this was their only chance. He hauled Fondue up and drove him toward the passage under the toppled water tower. The probe ran, but the Stalker saw that atop the tower, directly above the passage, sat the controller itself. A humanoid monster with dark brown skin. In desperation, Guppy shouted at it, asking what it wanted. The controller leaned down and unexpectedly waved a hand, letting the squad pass. Guppy shoved Fondue forward, and the whole group dashed under the tower, fleeing the anomalies and monsters.
As soon as Fondue, running first, crossed the invisible line, the air rippled. Guppy, rushing in after him, felt the world flip over. Space distorted, and they tumbled out onto a large, semicircular clearing. Here, bright orange grass grew, and dead trees draped in rusty bast and cobwebs stood all around. The entire group, including the blood-smeared werewolf, was present. The stunned stalkers tried to understand where they were. Guppy, dropping his backpack, declared he wouldn't take another step until he had some coffee. Guppy sat on the orange grass in the middle of the clearing, where the spatial anomaly had spewed them out, drinking fresh brewed coffee. He categorically refused to budge until he finished this ritual. Ricochet was fuming, while the others ate dry rations and collected themselves. Fly, determined by his instruments that they had been thrown to the west, very close to the dead city, about a 40-minute walk. Guppy realized the way back was cut off. Now he would have to go with the group to the bitter end, hoping to reach Pripyat and strike a deal with the Monolith. When the coffee was finished, the squad moved out, deciding against the sewers, which were likely mined, in favor of crossing the city on the surface. The group approached the outskirts of the dead city at dusk. They lay prone under a rusty fuel truck and began observation. The city was teeming with zombies, but they were behaving strangely. The dead were mimicking human life. Some were buying trash in shattered storefronts, others were talking, and still others were trying on old clothes. Sniper gates immediately spotted the ambush. Rifle barrels were protruding from the windows of the buildings. Snipers from the Freedom faction controlled the perimeter, herding victims into the city center. With the onset of darkness, the squad moved forward, using the last rookie, Fondue, as a live anomaly detector and bait. Fondue crawled toward a thorny bush, which turned out to be a carnivorous mutant. The plant's roots lunged at the boy, entangling his arms and legs. Guppy and Werewolf rushed to help, chopping the roots with knives and dragging the probe away before he became fertilizer. After a brief argument, they drove Fondue forward again. He checked a ditch. The group crossed it, but then a sniper trap was triggered. The squad came under fire. Fleeing the bullets, the stalkers burst into the nearest residential building, knocking over a zombie that got in their way. Inside, in a room with a piano and a chandelier, Ricochet chewed Fondue out for opening fire in a panic and unmasking the group. The American, Gates, quickly assembled his sniper rifle and took up a position. He needed Fondue as bait again. The probe was forced to climb out the window and run toward a toppled phone booth. As soon as the boy appeared on the street, a Freedom sniper fired, wounding him in the shoulder. Gates instantly tracked the flash and took out the shooter. Fondue, zigzagging, ran on, drawing fire from other snipers. Gates fought a duel, picking off enemies, but one of the shooters was faster. A bullet hit Fondue in the chest when he was 2 steps from cover. The probe died on the spot. Wasting no time, the group jumped out of the windows and dashed to the phone booth, leaving the corpse lying on the asphalt. The squad advanced deeper into the city. The zombies, which had been numerous during the day, had vanished somewhere. The streets seemed deserted. Gates warned that the snipers were deliberately herding them toward the central square, where the main slaughter was prepared. At an intersection, the group was caught in a crossfire. Shrek was hit in the side, but his body armor held. Rounding a corner, Guppy butt-stroked a motionless zombie at full run. The corpse turned out to be hard as stone, and the rifle stock snapped, lodging in its chest cavity. Suddenly, the sleeping zombies, standing all along the street like statues, came to life. The one Guppy had struck pulled the broken weapon from its chest, sniffed it, and grabbed the stalker by the throat.
Guppy shot it point blank, and Werewolf smashed the corpse's head in with his shotgun butt. The street instantly filled with a crowd of revived, rotting dead, advancing like a wall and forcing the humans out onto the exposed intersection. There was nowhere to retreat, so the group surged forward toward the square. Snipers on the roofs continued to fire, driving them into the trap. One bullet smashed Guppy's rifle, and he was forced to drop the useless iron and draw his pistols. Werewolf lobbed a grenade into a sniper's window, clearing the path. Bursting onto the square with its board of honor and toppled Lenin statue, the Stalkers saw it was packed with thousands of aggressive zombies fighting and devouring each other.
Sensing the living, the entire mass of dead turned and moved on the small squad. Werewolf and Shrek began hurling grenades. Guppy caught the rifle of the late Fondue thrown to him and opened fire. The group decided to break through to the city council building on the other side of the square, the only place with sturdy doors. A bloody meat grinder ensued. Guppy and Werewolf took point, literally hacking their way through the bodies, firing point blank, smashing skulls with rifle butts, using shotguns. The Americans and Monolith fighters covered the flanks and rear. Chunks of flesh flew through the air, black blood sprayed, and zombies grabbed the runners by their legs. For Guppy, time compressed into an endless cycle of changing magazines and shooting as they fought their way through this hell toward the saving doors.
Guppy felt neither joy nor relief when he finally saw the shattered paneling of the heavy wooden door before him. He felt only a leaden weariness and self-loathing as he was covered from head to toe in putrid blood and the slime of the dead. Fly was the last to scramble over the threshold. Werewolf, firing from the hip, downed the zombies pursuing them. Guppy tried to slam the door shut, but dozens of hands had already thrust through the gap. Ricochet drew his machete and began hacking at the limbs like weeds, severing gnarled fingers. Meanwhile, Werewolf reloaded his shotgun and gunned down 3 corpses crawling out of a side corridor. Only when the door was back in place did the soldiers barricade it with a heavy filing cabinet, piling a tattered sofa with jutting springs on top. The barricade was flimsy, but the zombies didn't try to break through it. Finding the passage blocked, they moved to the windows, thrusting their rotting hands through the bars. Werewolf shot one of them through the iron grate, taking off half its skull, but Guppy demanded he stop wasting ammo. The group caught its breath. Ricochet promised they would get weapons and clothes at a Monolith stash near the rusty forest. Bill Gates sat on the floor and began methodically stripping and cleaning his sniper rifle, wiping the parts with anti-static. The others waited. Werewolf and Fly argued with the Americans about smoking and NATO Army regulations. Guppy was interested in only one thing: why they had gone into the city when they could have bypassed it. They explained that on one side were impassable marshes, and on the other was sin territory, where certain death awaited them. When Gates finished with the rifle, and Fly noted that it was starting to get light, the squad moved deeper into the building. The corridors had once been luxurious, with oak paneling and parquet floors, but now everything was stripped and ruined. Broken furniture lay scattered in the offices. In one room, by the radiator, sat 2 rotted zombies who couldn't even stand, only and reaching out their hands. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the far corner of the office, from behind a screen constructed of old doors. It declared that if he had become a zombie, he wouldn't understand what was happening. Everyone instantly raised their weapons, but didn't fire. The screen crashed down. On the edge of a desk sat a man in a trench coat with a deep hood concealing his face. Ordered to raise his hands, he raised only his right, claiming his left was hurting.
The stranger behaved with provocative calm, asking if they wanted to check him for a pistol, and finally introduced himself as the journalist, a legendary figure, a hero of stalker myths. The journalist claimed he knew how to get out of the city and pass through the rusty forest. He explained the zombies' strange behavior as the work of the woodpecker radar. According to him, the dead mimic life when the radar operates in a specific mode and would calm down in exactly 32 minutes when the installation shut down for a break. He also criticized the group's plan to use the protective helmet, explaining that the woodpecker usually operated in several bands at once, which would drive the protection haywire. The only chance to pass was to use the rare windows when the radar operated in narrowband mode, and the journalist knew the schedule of these windows. Ricochet tried to argue and suspected a trap, but the stranger hopped off the desk. He turned out to be of enormous stature, taller than the tallest American. He announced that the zombies had calmed down and headed for the exit, shouldering Gates aside. Guppy looked at the dead men quieted by the radiator. They had indeed frozen and ceased reacting. Realizing they had no choice, Guppy followed the journalist. Ricochet ordered the rest to move out.
The journalist kept his word and led the squad out of the dead city, masterfully bypassing all the Freedom sniper ambushes. Only once did a shot ring out somewhere in the distance, but the bullet went wide. On the outskirts, however, the stalkers had to open fire twice to drive off packs of blind dogs. Deprived of the support of their alpha, the Chernobyl dog, the beasts didn't dare launch a direct attack, merely barking and snarling from a safe distance. During one skirmish, Werewolf offered his rifle to the unarmed journalist, but the man refused, stating he managed without weapons. This put Guppy on edge. In the zone, only legends like the Swamp Doctor or Semetsky walked around without a piece. The group left the urban ruins behind. Fly constantly checked his detector, logging dangerous anomalies. A powerful discharger, gravity pockets, and a burner hidden in the withered grass. The journalist, however, walked ahead confidently, skirting deadly traps as if he could see right through them or knew the map by heart. Soon, dawn began to break. The stalkers removed their night vision gear and saw just how filthy and pitiful they looked. To make matters worse, a terrible stench radiated from them. After putting 7 kilometers between themselves and the city, the squad reached a river lined with mutated reeds, whose hook-like seeds clung to their clothing. The journalist pointed to a clay section of the bank where they could wash up. The water was hot with radiation, but within acceptable limits for the zone. While everyone was cleaning themselves up, Guppy seized the moment to peek under the guide's hood. The journalist's face had human features, but the texture of the skin resembled old driftwood that had been soaking in water, and it was absolutely motionless. Noticing the stalker's gaze, the journalist merely twitched his fingers, and Guppy hurriedly looked away. The crossing consisted of 3 passenger cars submerged in the riverbed in such a way that one could cross to the other bank by stepping on their roofs. Guppy noticed an oddity. There was no wildlife around, not even the omnipresent rats or fleshes. A light rain began to fall. The journalist led the group tirelessly until Werewolf rebelled and demanded a halt for food. The guide agreed to stop only at the edge of the rusty forest, explaining that they couldn't go further due to the operation of the woodpecker psi radar. They had to wait for a window in the emissions. Cresting a hill, they saw the rusty forest. The trees were covered in rusty, fibrous growths, symbiotes that fed on radiation and secreted acid upon contact. The journalist warned that there were no living creatures in the forest, only zombies and zombified stalkers,
who were to be shot without warning. He snapped off a long branch and walked point, knocking the poisonous growths out of the path. They set up camp in the very first clearing. The journalist ate his canned food while holding the tin with his foot, still hiding his left hand. While the group ate, strings of zombies shuffled past, heading toward the dead city. Werewolf, out of boredom, started a conversation about necrophilia, recalling stories from his late friend Salo, which disgusted the others. One of the dead men threw up his arms and headed toward their camp, and Werewolf blew his head off with a shotgun blast. The journalist explained that this behavior was caused by the radar's operation. Soon, a man emerged from the forest. Ricochet recognized him as a stalker from his own clan named Guzzler, and joyfully called out to him, giving away the group's position. But Guzzler, zombified by the emissions, silently raised his rifle and unleashed a long burst from the hip. Bullets grazed Ricochet's helmet and body armor. While the Monolith fighter pressed himself into the dirt, screaming hysterically and trying to reason with his former comrade, Guzzler reloaded and continued firing. The American, Gates, put an end to it by coolly shooting the zombie right between the eyes. After the fight, Ricochet began complaining of an unbearable itch in his back. He tried scratching it with a twig, but it didn't help. Guppy forced him to strip. Beneath his body armor and clothes, a gruesome picture was revealed. Ricochet's entire back was webbed with thick, pulsating blue swellings resembling veins, which bled where he had scratched them. It became clear this was the consequence of contact with the bad wall in the apartment in the dead city, where the poltergeist had rampaged. Werewolf joked grimly that now Ricochet knew what to ask the Monolith for.
Guppy took out the diagnostic injector medkit he had stolen from the scientists and applied the cartridge to the victim's back. The device flashed its indicators and delivered the verdict. Condition not diagnosed. Symptomatic treatment recommended. It was a death sentence. Werewolf declared that Ricochet was finished if even American tech was powerless. The journalist, however, remarked philosophically that the most interesting part was just beginning. Guppy hid the device, deciding not to waste any more scarce cartridges on a doomed man. The medicine might come in handy for himself. The night passed quietly, but just before morning, the silence was torn apart by a firefight. A group of 5 zombified stalkers stumbled upon the camp. There were no familiar faces among them, so the squad met them with a wall of lead. 2 were dropped immediately by a combined volley. Gates took out 2 more with his sniper rifle, and the last one, likely wounded, crawled into the bushes or fled. They sat down for breakfast by a small fire, though there was no real need for one. Guppy felt shattered, suffering without his morning coffee. Everyone stayed silent about Ricochet's sickness, but the Monolith fighter's condition had visibly worsened. He incessantly scratched his back, chest, and shoulders, and the bluish welts had already crept up his neck and onto his hands. His face had turned a sickly pale. Shrek asked the journalist about the time of the window in the radar's operation. He reported that the shutdown would occur at 17:21 and last exactly 18 minutes and 42 seconds. The journalist refused to go himself, stating he wasn't suited for the task. Shrek volunteered, as he had the protective helmet and experience testing it. The guide gave the American detailed instructions. It was about a 15-minute run to the bunker entrance. Landmarks: a tree with a broken branch. Turn left 10 meters before reaching it to avoid a burner or a discharger. Next, a tree with a corkscrew trunk. Bypass it on the right. Then jump over the ditch without looking down. After the ditch, a bush wrapped in rusty bast. Turn sharp right there. If you've done it right, the radar antenna will be ahead. On the way to it,
skirt a powerful gravity concentrate, a gray, sunken patch of Earth. The bunker door is locked with a manual wheel. 2 turns counterclockwise and pull. Inside, on the first level, find the emergency breaker, kill the system, and wait for the group. Do not go down to the lower level. There are pseudo-giants down there. While they waited for departure time, everyone busied themselves. Werewolf bandaged his wound. Fly watched the forest. Guppy stripped and reassembled the trophy rifle, which seemed unreliable to him. Gates and Shrek calibrated the helmet. Ghosts began to appear in the forest, a consequence of the woodpecker shifting modes. Guppy saw the whitish figure of a girl with a vaguely familiar face and even rushed after her, but the journalist stopped him, explaining it was a hallucination. Werewolf saw a ghost in the form of a drunk in a quilted jacket. When the time came, Shrek put on the helmet, fastened the strap, and switched on the console. Guppy started the timer. The American bolted, running the route, following the journalist's instructions exactly. Turned at the tree, ducked under a branch, and vanished from sight. Fly tracked his movement on the life-form detector until the signal died. The journalist stood calmly, not looking at his watch, stating confidently that Shrek would make it. Ricochet was nervous, scratching himself and fuming over the delay, afraid they wouldn't make it to the other bunker under Pripyat before the emission. Guppy understood the Monolith fighters sensed death approaching and was pinning all his hopes on the Monolith. The timer counted down. The journalist, without turning around, declared that Shrek had arrived. Immediately, Fly's PDA beeped. A message came in that Shrek was in the bunker and searching for the control center. Werewolf and Gates cheered up. Soon came a second message. Control center found. Fly started speculating aloud about who built these autonomous radars and why, surmising they were designed to operate even after a catastrophe. The journalist confirmed that the CNPP housed the most powerful radar, capable of piercing any protection. When Werewolf asked why the journalist came with them if he didn't believe in success, he replied that there were no other options, and sharply raised his head. In that same second, Fly read the final message from Shrek. Radar disabled.
The group entered the bunker through a heavy steel door with a locking wheel, resembling a submarine hatch. Behind it lay a narrow metal staircase leading down into corridors with peeling, dirty blue paint on the walls and eternal fluorescent lamps buzzing under the ceiling. Shrek met the new arrivals with excitement, claiming to have found priceless materials on the O Consciousness project, to which all 3 zone radars were related. The journalist harshly cut short his enthusiasm with a question about security. He ordered them to immediately check and block the passages to the lower level, where, according to him, pseudo-giants nested. Shrek and Gates went to execute the order, to lock the doors or install motion sensors in the narrow passages. Leaving their gear, the stalkers proceeded to the control center. Behind sliding glass doors lay a spacious room, furnished in strict military order. Desks without pedestals, flat monitors, membrane keyboards, and laser mice. No papers or personal effects, only tech. On the active screens glowed a logo, the letter O with the inscription "Consciousness" in a circle. Guppy, dreaming of coffee, hopefully asked about a canteen, but the journalist disappointed him, reporting that the kitchen and warehouses were located on the dangerous lower level. Guppy cursed and collapsed into a chair in exhaustion. Fly tended to Ricochet, settling him on the floor on a foil blanket. The Monolith commander's condition was critical. He was pale, shivering with fever, and the bluish, pulsating welts, which had previously been only on his back, had now crawled onto his neck, cheekbones, and hands. Fly injected him with a painkiller from an injector pistol. While the wounded man drifted into a narcotic sleep, the journalist began questioning Fly about how they had hooked up with the Americans. It turned out the soldiers themselves had been looking for guides to the NPP near the Catch-22 bar by the Monolith training camp, offering protective helmets and equipment in return. The Americans returned, reporting that the lower level was securely blocked. Gates and Shrek sat at the computers, studying the data. Fly boiled some water and offered everyone tea or 3-in-1 instant coffee, which Guppy refused with disdain. While the stalkers rested and Werewolf smoked one cigarette after another, Gates pulled a portable device and a screwdriver from his pack. He began unscrewing the back panel of a monitor to connect directly to the server and download data. Seeing this, Guppy instantly placed his rifle across his knees, barrel pointed at the American, and demanded he stop. He stated that in the zone, the smart ones live longer because they don't stick their noses where they don't belong. Shrek tried to object, arguing that this information could reveal the secret of the zone and save humanity. At gunpoint, Gates was forced to put the screws back. Shrek swiveled in his chair and began explaining the essence of the O Consciousness project. According to him, the explosions at the CNPP were the result of consciousness control experiments, and the Monolith clan and military stalkers were funded by the same source to guard this secret. This statement triggered a furious outburst of anger from Fly. Shrek showed a schematic of the radar's operation on the monitor. He explained that the installation could influence the emotions and behavior of people and zombies over a huge radius, inducing aggression, submission, or even love. The American pontificated about saving the world from psychotropic weapons, but Werewolf interrupted him. The sinner delivered a vicious tirade, saying he didn't give a damn about the fate of the world, since his own life and the lives of his loved ones in the big land was a struggle for survival in poverty, and this world wasn't worth saving. Guppy cut the conversation short. He grimly reminded them that his only goal was to survive, and he wouldn't allow risking his life for curiosity or saving humanity. The stalker promised to personally shoot anyone who touched a keyboard or server without his permission, as the consequences of meddling with an unknown system could be fatal. Gates was outraged by the insanity of it all, to which the journalist calmly replied that this was simply the zone, and one had to get used to it. By morning, Ricochet's condition had become critical. The bluish welts had crawled from his shoulders to his face, twisting it into a hideous mask. He was coughing up blood, and it was clear to everyone he wasn't long for this world. At exactly 10 a.m., strictly on schedule, the emission struck. First came a low-frequency hum from the bowels of the earth, then a tremor, and reality tilted, losing its outlines. Guppy managed the dizziness by counting to 10, and as soon as the world snapped back into its usual frame, he gave the order to move. Ricochet couldn't walk, so Fly injected a triple dose of stimulants directly into his neck. The dying man stood up, swaying but staying on his feet. Shrek zeroed the radar timer, and the group vacated the control center. From below, from the sealed levels, came dull thuds. Pseudo-giants, sensing the emission, were trying to break out. It was damp in the rusty forest. Ricochet slowed their progress, hanging on the arms of Fly and Shrek. Werewolf pulled Guppy aside and proposed an alliance. The Monolith fighter was dying. Fly was nothing without him. The Americans had their own agenda, and the journalist was terrifying. They agreed to stick together to the end. To pass the time on the road, Guppy told the sinner the story of Romeo and Juliet.
Soon the forest ended, and the squad emerged at a massive vehicle graveyard. The journalist hopped into the bed of an old truck, awaiting directions, but Ricochet could no longer speak. His tongue had swollen and lolled out of his mouth. He gestured for a medkit, injected himself with 3 more ampules, and collapsed in convulsions. The journalist pronounced him dead. Guppy acted instantly. He took out a capsule, mixed dead water in a dispenser, and injected it into the corpse's neck. The body arched. A wheeze escaped the throat. But half a minute later, Ricochet stood up. He had died, but returned as a zombie, retaining motor skills and remnants of memory. Zombie Ricochet led the group through the graveyard of machines, jumping from roof to roof and skirting anomalies. Fly tried to ask Guppy about his friend's fate, but the Stalker replied that Ricochet was now just a walking corpse that would complete the mission and be discarded. They reached an old refrigerator trailer without wheels. Inside, Ricochet dug through some trash and found a hatch with a smart lock. Despite his decaying brain, the zombie correctly answered the security questions about his mother's maiden name and favorite movie, disabled the cyanide defense system, and opened the passage. The group descended into an underground bunker, a rich Monolith stash. There were racks of weapons, food, and high-class protective suits. Guppy immediately rushed to find coffee, but found only a cheap surrogate. The journalist, standing in the middle of the room, suddenly demanded they leave immediately, sensing danger. Guppy, without arguing, began packing backpacks, weapons, food, 5 suits. They decided not to take Ricochet. The zombie sat on a table, greedily shoving heated canned food into his mouth with his hands, smearing mash over his face. Werewolf tried to shake information about the security system out of him, but Ricochet remembered nothing. When the sinner struck him, the zombie lashed back, clawing Werewolf's face. At that moment, a door slammed at the far end of the corridor, and a voice rang out. "Gotcha, Ricochet!" Unknowns had blocked the entrance, demanding the Monolith fighters be handed over. The journalist walked up to the zombie and calmly told him that his friends had come for him. Ricochet obediently hopped off the table and walked into the dark corridor toward the voice. Halfway there, he stepped on a bounding mine. The explosion scattered shrapnel, destroying the zombie. Gates dashed to the second exit, heaved open the heavy door, and immediately fell dead with a bullet in his forehead. Shrek, using his comrade's body as a shield and bait, managed to spot the sniper. He was in a trench 120 meters down the slope, covered by bushes. It was impossible to reach him with a grenade. Guppy found a solution. He took the Dragon's Eye artifact, placed it in the capsule with the residue of the dead water, and handed it to Shrek. The American shook the infernal cocktail and hurled the capsule toward the trench. 12 seconds later, Shrek lifted Gates's corpse again. No shot followed. The artifact, combined with the dead water, had created a field that caused instantaneous cardiac arrest. The group left the bunker, stepping over Gates's body. Werewolf took a brand new machine gun with him. The journalist pointed the way to the station, bypassing Pripyat. Emerging onto the slope, Werewolf lit a cigarette and succinctly characterized the situation with one word.
Mess. The group settled down for the night amidst a pile of concrete slabs and rings, as no other shelter could be found near the NPP. The radiation level here exceeded the norm by 7 times, so Shrek handed out anti-rad pills to everyone. Guppy noticed that the journalist took the meds but never actually swallowed them. The night passed relatively calmly, save for a visit from 3 wandering zombies at 3 in the morning.
Guppy and Fly, standing watch, initially tried to shoo them away, but the mindless dead kept climbing into the shelter. The stalkers were forced to take their heads off and drag the stinking corpses away to avoid attracting scavengers. Near morning, at dawn, a young bloodsucker emerged near the camp. It circled, vanishing into invisibility, then reappearing, flexing its muscles and sleek hide. Shrek and Werewolf didn't wait for an attack. The American let the monster get within 5 meters and fired a round from his underbarrel grenade launcher into its chest. Werewolf immediately finished off the writhing beast with a long burst from his brand new light machine gun, turning the body into a sieve. After the fight, Werewolf was puzzled by the monster's anatomy, finding no genitalia. The journalist suggested the organs might be hidden in the mouth tentacles, which caused a fit of disgust and rage in the sinner. He kicked the dead carcass with all his might. Breakfast was cold. Guppy suffered from the lack of coffee, trying to dull the withdrawal with chewing gum, and noticed that the journalist wasn't drinking water at all and only pretended to eat. The stalkers began donning the protective suits brought from the Monolith bunker. This was the elite gear of military stalkers: multi-layer armor made of polymorph plastic and fireproof foil, a waste recycling system, built-in radiation shielding, sensors that instantly hardened the armor at the point of impact, and an exoskeleton to amplify muscle power. The helmet provided panoramic vision and air filtration. The journalist refused the suit. The squad moved out toward the old defensive line. Werewolf tried to tell tall tales, but the journalist stopped abruptly, spotting thin wire whiskers near his boot. They had walked into a minefield. The journalist ordered them to wait. Soon, a whole army of mutants appeared from the grove on the horizon, driven from the center of the zone by the emission. Pseudo-giants, bloodsuckers, fleshes, controllers disoriented by the crowd, and even a rare chimera. 100 monsters moved straight across the minefield. A barrage began. Mines detonated one after another, tearing fleshes to shreds and toppling giants. The chimera, possessing incredible instincts, dodged Shrek's bullets. But even the monsters began to understand the danger, trying to walk single file. When the wave of mutants subsided, leaving a path of torn bodies, the journalist gave the command to move out. They forced Fly to go first, as he had detectors, though he lacked a minesweeper. The Monolith fighter walked 20 meters, successfully bypassing 6 mines, but on the 7th, his luck ran out. "Stop!" the journalist yelled. Fly froze. He was standing on a bounding mine. The moment he lifted his foot, the projectile would jump up and explode. Disarming such a mechanism without a sapper was impossible. The journalist didn't stop. He bypassed the frozen Fly, jumping over mutant corpses. Along the way, he kicked a still-living bloodsucker in the snout. Guppy, following behind, finished the monster with 2 shots to the head. Werewolf and Shrek passed their comrade, dropping a short, "Sorry." The group was leaving Fly as a living dead man in the middle of the field. Maddened by horror and betrayal, Fly screamed, cursing his companions, and opened fire at their backs. The burst hit the retreating men, but the smart armor of the suits withstood the impacts. Werewolf, his face buried in the guts of a torn flesh, rolled onto his back, drew his shotgun, and fired blindly toward Fly. The Monolith fighter flinched, whether from the impact or fear, and stepped off the mine. The bouncing Betty flew up 1.5 meters and turned into a fireball, tearing Fly apart. The group got up and continued on their way. Werewolf admiringly patted himself on the back where the armor had stopped 3 bullets. The journalist merely remarked coldly that against the armor-piercing rounds of military stalkers, these suits wouldn't help.
The 4 survivors, Guppy, Shrek, the journalist, and Werewolf, crested the low hill. Before them lay a plain bisected by a small river, and in the distance, the smokestacks of the Chernobyl NPP and the concrete boxes of old defensive fortifications were visible. But the path was barred by a horde of monsters. Dozens of creatures stood between the hill and the entrance to the trenches, not attacking, but waiting, as if certain the humans would walk right into their claws. Werewolf shifted his grip on the brand-new machine gun, and the squad launched a frontal assault, for there was no other way. The Sinner took point, continuously spraying the monsters with lead. The journalist moved right behind him, his task solely to feed fresh ammo belts to the gunner in time. Any delay of a few seconds meant death. Guppy and Shrek covered the flanks, picking off the most aggressive beasts and lobbing grenades from their underbarrel launchers. It was a true meat grinder. Bursts of fire, explosions, magazine changes. Finally, the group slid to the bottom of the trench. Werewolf immediately spun around and cut down a bloodsucker that had lunged after them. Shrek blasted a flying creature out of the air. The group ran through the maze of trenches. The walls were reinforced with concrete beams painted with numbers in ascending order. Near beam 34, Guppy kicked off a dog and slit its throat. At beam 56, the trench turned at a right angle. Werewolf dashed around the corner and ran straight into a fortified machine gun nest. From behind the sandbags rose a military stalker in a camouflage suit with a mirrored visor and a mushroom cloud emblem. A burst of fire knocked Werewolf against the wall. He returned fire, and Shrek tossed 2 grenades behind the parapet, but neither of them exploded. The situation became critical. 2 more military stalkers appeared, pinning the group down with fire. Guppy ordered a retreat, realizing they were trapped. At that moment, the journalist did the impossible. He moved with inhuman speed, his silhouette blurring in the air. He leaped onto the parapet, jumped back, and rushed the machine gun nest. Thrusting his right hand forward with splayed fingers, he slammed the soldiers against the wall with an invisible psychokinetic blow. Then, he freed his left limb from under his coat. It was not a hand, but a giant claw, resembling the limb of a mantis. With one swipe, he took the heads off both enemies. The journalist jumped down to Werewolf, who was lying at the bottom of the trench. The Sinner's chest was shredded by bullets. The biosensor showed a critical condition. The journalist ripped off his helmet and stripped the suit. It looked as if he wanted to strangle the wounded man, but Werewolf coughed. The journalist demanded an injector from Guppy. The stalker tossed the device. The display suggested euthanasia as the recommended option, but the journalist chose a temporary restoration of functions. Shrek leveled his rifle at the journalist, demanding to know who he was. The man, calling himself simply the journalist, warned that the biosensors of the dead soldiers had already transmitted an alarm, and a platoon was moving their way. Werewolf, dying and coughing up blood, raved that the Monolith would not let him die because it owed him a debt. He tried to point the way. The journalist effortlessly threw the Sinner's body over his shoulder and ran on. On the run, Guppy explained to the shocked Shrek that their companion was an Islam, a fracture, a rare mutant, once human, possessing telepathy and telekinesis, feared by all creatures of the zone. Werewolf began to twitch on the Islam's shoulder, pointing to a beam numbered 96. He wheezed that here was the entrance to a bunker dug by Bureaus to eat corpses, and died without finishing his sentence. The journalist dumped the body by the wall. Shrek aimed his weapon at the mutant again, asking about mind reading, but the journalist silently began dismantling the sandbag wall. Guppy joined him,
and soon felt a void behind it. They widened the hole. Guppy was the first to crawl into the old abandoned bunker, filled with stench, rags, and gnawed bones. A Burer lair. The door leading to the communications tunnels had been torn off its hinges. Guppy realized the military had sealed this bunker after the second explosion, but the Burers had broken in from the outside. Shrek crawled in after him. The journalist dragged Werewolf's corpse inside. When Shrek asked why, the Islam replied that it was a gift for the Burers, who loved carrion. The American, furious, wanted to shoot, but the journalist calmly displayed his hideous left claw, making it clear that an attack was pointless. Guppy didn't interfere, sipping a nutrient mix through the tube in his helmet. The journalist demanded Guppy point the way. The stalker focused, recalling the map from the flash drive he had seen in his stash. He reconstructed the route in his memory and nodded confidently. The journalist hoisted Werewolf's corpse onto his shoulder again and invited everyone to descend. Guppy stepped onto the landing, switched on a powerful flashlight, and began descending the steep, narrow stairs into the pitch-black darkness of the shaft. Behind him came the Islam with the body and Shrek. At the bottom, they found themselves in a concrete room with 3 arched passages and a gutted electrical cabinet. Guppy shone his light and confidently pointed to the left passage. Shrek tried to object, poking a finger at a skull and crossbones painted on the wall next to that tunnel. But Guppy merely called him a fool and stepped into the darkness. Guppy asked the Islam if he sensed the presence of Burers, since his detector was useless inside this concrete coffin. The journalist replied that the creatures were everywhere, behind the walls and beneath the floor. The group moved through an endless labyrinth of monotonous corridors, featuring peeling, dirty blue paint and caged fluorescent lights. Strange symbols periodically appeared on the walls: spirals, Celtic crosses, schematic drawings, which the American, Shrek, meticulously recorded on his dictaphone. Along the way, the journalist showed his hand. He knew Shrek was an agent of a nameless, top-secret agency, sent to gather information on the O Consciousness Project and the Monolith. The guide also confirmed that he was indeed the legendary journalist, mutated into an Islam after a trek to the center of the zone, and now hoped the Monolith would restore his human form. Traces of the dwarves' habitation appeared along the path: rags, droppings, gnawed bones, and tin cans flattened against the walls by telekinetic impacts. The group discussed the nature of the Monolith. The journalist speculated it was either a tool for influencing the noosphere that had opened a gate to hell, or a super-powerful artifact holding open a rift in space. Suddenly, the journalist halted the squad. Ahead, about 100 meters away, at a circular junction of 4 tunnels, a massive crowd of Burers had gathered. Shrek suggested fragging them with grenades, but Guppy explained that the telekinetics would simply fling the explosives right back. The journalist went to negotiate first. Guppy switched his flashlight to a red filter and saw dozens of whitish eyes. The entire area was packed with dwarves in rags sitting on the floor. The Islam demonstrated his mutated left limb, resembling a mantis claw, and then brought forward Werewolf's corpse as an offering. The crowd of Burers silently parted. They didn't walk, but levitated, clearing a path. The journalist walked to the center, shouted something in a guttural language, and threw the sinner's body onto the floor. The dwarves began to converge on the meat. Seizing the chaos of the ensuing feeding frenzy, the journalist gestured for his companions to move toward the left passage along the wall. Guppy went first, fending off curious mutants with the barrel of his rifle. Shrek followed, sidling along the wall. The journalist got bogged down in the crowd, but waved at them, ordering them to leave.
At that moment, one of the Bureaus attacked Gupi, striking him in the shoulder with an invisible telekinetic hammer and hurling him against the wall. Gupi knew he couldn't shoot, but Shrek's nerves snapped. The American opened fire with his automatic rifle. It was a death sentence. The Bureaus easily deflected the bullets, merely scratching one of their kin, but the rest instantly switched their attention to the shooter. Dozens of hands shot upward. Shrek had the rifle ripped from his hands. He drew a pistol, but that too flew from his palm, smashing against the wall. Realizing the agent was done for, Guppy butt-stroked a lunging dwarf and dashed toward the saving passage. The run was short, but the Bureaus tried to stop the Stalker. He took a powerful telekinetic blow to the back, then a terrible impact to the chest that blacked out his vision. Only the suit's armor saved him. Otherwise, his ribs would have pierced his heart. Guppy switched his light to full brightness, scattering the nearest beasts, and saw the arched passage rapidly being sealed by brickwork appearing out of thin air. Deciding the wall was either a phantom or an illusion, Guppy rammed it with his shoulder at full speed. The illusion vanished, but behind it lay a real concrete wall.
The impact sent the Stalker flying back, rolling across the floor and dropping his light. He scrambled up, snatched his weapon, and looked back. Shrek was beyond saving. The journalist had also disappeared into the mob. Suddenly, in the center of the hall where the mutants were devouring Werewolf's corpse, a blinding, gigantic fireball flared up. The fire instantly incinerated the burrers and blasted outward in all directions. Guppy spun around and sprinted down the corridor, abandoning his light and rifle, fleeing the firestorm. The wave of flame caught him, slammed into his back, lifted him up, and hurled him into the black void of oblivion. Guppy woke up in absolute darkness and silence. He didn't understand where he was, and remembered nothing after the impact of the fire wave. Raising his hand with difficulty, he felt the plastic visor of his helmet, and realized he was still in his protective suit. He checked the system settings. The sound was on. It was just that total silence reigned around him. A dim patch of light was visible in the distance. Guppy reached out, touched the wall, and suddenly the patch turned into a bright flashlight beam, hitting him in the face. It was the journalist Islam. He returned the lost flashlight to the Stalker. It turned out there was no hell or fiery abyss. They were in the same concrete corridor of the catacombs, just 100 meters from the platform with the burrers. The journalist explained that the wall and the firestorm were hallucinations caused by the Monolith's operation. But Shrek had likely died for real from a psychokinetic blow, which pierces any armor. They moved on through the endless gray corridors. Suddenly, Guppy heard a splash. Dark, opaque water began to flood the corridor floor. It rose rapidly, first to ankle height, then to the knees, soaking the journalist's trench coat. The water mesmerized the Stalker, beckoning him, and hundreds of voices began to sound in his head. When the level rose to the waist, the journalist grabbed Guppy by the hand, preventing him from removing his helmet, and harshly ordered him to look into his eyes. His companion's face looked like a jade mask with burning eyes. The Islam convinced the Stalker that the water was an illusion created by the Monolith. Guppy forced himself to believe, looked down, and the water vanished. The floor was absolutely dry. They continued their journey. New markings in the form of oblique crosses appeared on the walls, and ghostly fireflies and whitish figures swirled in the air. A giant ghostly boar rushed at them, roaring from the darkness, forcing the travelers to press against the walls, but it passed right through them and dissolved. The journalist admitted that he was suffering from withdrawal,
and hearing alien thoughts about the fate of humanity. At the next fork, Guppy saw a sign in the shape of an eye on the wall and turned there, climbing a metal ladder to a ceiling hatch. The journalist climbed up first, but couldn't open the rusted lid even with his inhuman strength. Then Guppy sent the Islam down and climbed up himself. He took a dispenser from his backpack containing a rare artifact substance called rupture, which is harvested near poltergeists. The Stalker thickly smeared the hatch hinges with the opalescent paste. The substance instantly began to destroy the metal, as if cutting it with a hacksaw. Guppy struck the lid with his shoulder, the hinges snapped, and the hatch flew aside with a crash. The Stalker vaulted up, rifle at the ready. They found themselves in a clean, cool room resembling a computer lab. Air conditioning, racks with equipment, and long tables with monitors. A man's head and hands appeared from behind one monitor. It was an old man with long gray hair, wearing a dirty lab coat over his naked body, barefoot. He introduced himself as the Chief. The old man behaved strangely. His voice changed, sounding now like a duet, now hoarse, his mood swinging from the aggression of a street punk to the benevolence of a Buddha. He stated that there were no guards here, but he controlled the mental entities of people, peers, working with the Monolith behind the wall. Currently, there were 72 of them, but more were needed.
The chief claimed that the Monolith itself had summoned the heroes here. The journalist entered into a discussion about the nature of the Monolith and the possibility of shutting it down, but Guppy interrupted the philosophical disputes by slamming his rifle butt on the table. The Stalker declared that he didn't give a damn about saving the world and just wanted to look at the Monolith to get out. The chief, complaining of loneliness and fatigue, agreed to escort them. He stood up heavily, took a gray remote with buttons from the table, which he called the remote for everything, and pointed it at the far door. The door slid smoothly open, revealing a passage into a dimly lit corridor with pink tiles. The chief walked ahead with a shuffling gait. Guppy, following him, asked about the hole where the monsters were crawling from, but the old man replied that there was no hole. To the question about coffee, the chief merely looked at the Stalker as if he were insane. Guppy and the journalist walked down the corridor with pink tiles, trailing the old man who called himself the Chief. Guppy noticed that his own shadow was acting strangely, signaling to him and living a life of its own, while the journalist cast no shadow at all. When asked about this, the Islam replied that he didn't know if he was supposed to have one. Music began to drift through the air, the sound of a sitar and bongos. Guppy ran his finger along the wall, and a glowing, psychedelic trail of acid colors lingered behind his hand. The Stalker voiced his displeasure that, in the center of the zone, instead of aliens or Nazis, they had met a filthy old man with a remote control who looked like an unwashed Einstein. The chief stopped at a blank wall, declaring he wanted to show them the piers. Suddenly, a door with a plaque appeared on the wall. The chief pressed a button on the remote, and harsh, shadowless light flooded the space. They entered a massive hall with no visible walls. The entire space was filled with bunks resembling anatomical tables. On them lay motionless human bodies covered with sheets, from beneath which protruded heels bearing tags. The people's heads were hidden under grid-like cowls, from which cables and hoses stretched to the ceiling. The chief explained that these were the piers ensuring the Monolith's operation, and launched into a rambling dissertation on how a half-alive human is mathematically equal to a half-dead one. The journalist interrupted him, demanding to see the Monolith. The chief pressed a button, the light died, and the group found themselves back in the corridor.
The old man drew a rectangle of a door in the air with his finger, and they stepped inside. The walls and ceiling vanished. The heroes found themselves in a colossal hall bathed in pink light and filled with enchanting music and fragrances. In the center hung a massive black crystal, the Monolith. Guppy felt an irresistible urge to dissolve into it. The chief ruined the moment with his creaky voice. The journalist reacted instantly. He thrust his mutated left limb forward, grabbed the old man, and tore him in half, flinging the pieces aside. However, the chief immediately reappeared, whole and unharmed. Guppy raised his rifle and emptied half a magazine into the old man. Then, without looking back, tossed a grenade. The explosion roared, but when the smoke cleared, the chief was still standing there. The old man pressed a button on the remote, and the delusion vanished. The group stood in the middle of a filthy room, piled with trash and the corpses of decomposing stalkers. In the center towered a rusty, patched-up unit resembling an autoclave. The chief claimed that this was the true Monolith, and the corpses were those who had come here out of curiosity and died happy. Guppy approached the unit and peered into the thick glass of the porthole. Inside, yellow sludge churned, forming before his eyes into Guppy's own mutilated face, biting off its own tongue. Guppy recoiled. The journalist stood with his forehead pressed against the wall. The stalker asked what to do, but the Islam didn't know. Guppy drew his pistol and shot the chief exactly between the eyes. The bullet blew out a shard of the occiput. The old man fell, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. But a couple of minutes later, he stood up, wiped his face, and wagged a finger, advising them to think next time. He announced the grand finale of the program and pressed the button on the remote again.
The surroundings changed. Guppy found himself in a boundless field of flowers under an azure sky. Instead of a sun, a black monolith shone above. The journalist was gone. The chief informed him that the Islam had received what he wanted, and that everyone had their own hell. The old man led Guppy to a wooden veranda draped in ivy and wild grapes. On the veranda stood wicker chairs, small tables, and a large brazier filled with hot sand. Nearby hung dozens of copper chesves, along with jars of elite coffee varieties, sugar, cream, and spices. The chief asked the stalker's opinion. Guppy replied that it was magnificent and exactly what he had dreamed of. The chief clapped his hands and vanished. Guppy took a chesve, poured in water, added ground coffee, and buried the vessel in the hot sand. Having brewed the coffee, he sat in a wicker chair and drank, savoring the aroma and taste. He sifted through the memories of the last few days, trying to understand where reality had ended, and came to the conclusion that reality didn't exist at all. Organ music played. Guppy felt absolute peace and realized he needed nothing more. He lowered his hand, picked up his assault rifle from the floor, clicked the safety off, and racked the slide. The stalker braced the stock against the wicker of the chair, placed the barrel under his chin, and pulled the trigger.